We're good?
Try it now, Alan.
All right. Share screen. Okay, share.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So Dungeness crabs. There's a Dungeness crab, Cancer magister. Recently, like about 5 or 6 years ago, the genus got changed to Metacarcinus magister. So you can call them Metacarcinus or Cancer. They both seem to go fine. Range. They range from the Aleutian Islands all the way down to Pismo Beach. However, the population is broken into 2 groups, Alaska gyre and the California current. What happens is the west wind drift and the subarctic current comes across the northern North Pacific, and as it approaches the North American continent, it splits in 2. Parts goes north and becomes the Alaska current, part comes south and becomes the California current. And that splits the population of Dungeness crabs into one in the Gulf of Alaska and the second population in the California current. The population dynamics of the 2 populations is really different. And so I'm going to mostly be talking about actually entirely talking about the California current population, because that's what we're dealing with. That's where I've been working. Okay, adult habitat. They live on sand, sandy mud from roughly the surf zone out to at least 300 feet, and they like being within estuaries. In other words, within the California current, it is a huge habitat. They're opportunistic feeders. They prey on things like small fish, worms, clams, anything they can get their little claws on. They like eating carrion, things that stink, so basically they end up being sort of like vultures, which is how they are caught. The trap fishery uses basically stinky bait, which attracts the crabs into the trap. They're a large armored crustacean, and they don't really, once they become adults, have a lot of predators. Big sharks that feed on the bottom, and large rays, and people, we're the biggest predators by far. The juvenile habitat, they've been observed at really high densities on sand, sandy mud, rock reefs, gravel, estuaries, at a depth from shallow subtidal to at least 150 feet. In other words, it looks like baby crabs are everywhere. They are also opportunistic feeders. They just feed on smaller prey. They're attracted by smell really actively, and they are highly cannibalistic. They eat each other really happily. Predators, everything larger than they are, eat them. The summer is a very dangerous time, as they settle at the beginning of summer and they have to grow through summer, getting bigger and bigger. And so during that period of time, everything under the sun eats them, including each other. So every time they molt from a hard shell crab into a soft shell crab, they're prone to getting cannibalized. So to recruit, they really have to make it through that extremely dangerous first summer. When I say they settle at high densities, this is what it looks like. So the megalopy, which is the last larval stage, they settle to the bottom, and they can settle at 1,000 per meter squared. And we've seen them up to like 20,000 per meter squared. This appears to be a common event. They're sexual dimorphic in size. Males are bigger than females. Males get to be about 9 inches, females up to 6 inches. The females produce from somewhere around about 700,000 to 2.3 million eggs a year. Animals reach sexual maturity at about 1.5 years, and males and females can live 6 to 8 years. So in other words, a female reproductive output over the course of its life is somewhere on the order of 10 to 15 million eggs, a lot. Males used to live 6 to 8 years. With the current fishery in the California current, when they get to about 6 inches, they enter the fishery. They become a legally fished crab. And nearly all the male crabs at 6 inches are caught. And it takes them 4 years about to get from a megalope settling to the bottom to a fishable crab. Most mating occurs in spring as the female molts. Males are attracted to females as they're about to molt by pheromones, chemicals released by the female. Prior to molt, the males guard the females, and larger males are more successful. So this picture here is a large male crab carrying around a female crab that's about to molt, and then he's going to mate with her after she is molted. He carries her around till the shell hardens, and then he makes a sperm plug gluing her. Males can mate with multiple females, and they compete for females, which is why they've evolved to be larger than the females, because you've got this male to male mating. Females store the sperm until egg extrusion and fertilization in the fall. So in other words, over the whole summer, they've stored that sperm that they've gotten during the mating event. Egg development takes about 3 to 4 months in the California current. Eggs hatch in the winter around Oregon and Washington, December to March. The larval period is about 80 to 160 days, and the larvae go through 5 zoea stages. This is a zoea here, and then molt into something called a megalope. This is a megalope down here. The megalope looks a lot like a crab, except that they have the abdomen folds out and they can swim. And these guys swim really well. These guys can go cruise at 40 centimeters a second. They're extremely good swimmers. Then they molt from the megalope into a little tiny crab, and then the crab during the first summer goes through a whole bunch of molts, and then eventually molts into an adult crab. In Coos Bay, Oregon, megalope begin to return to shore and settle from roughly April through September. The fishery is intense. Nearly all legal-sized male crabs are caught each year, yet the fishery has not crashed. It appears to be sustainable. What we've got here is the horizontal axis is year, and the vertical axis is the number of vessels fishing. And what you'll notice is that up until early 70, there was only less than 100 boats in Oregon fishing. The open circles is Washington. And then in Oregon, the number of boats fishing just takes off. This is when the federal government started the economic exclusion zone, where they said, we have control over the 200 miles out and nobody else can fish there. At that point, the federal government said, oh, well, we'd better build up our fishing fleet. And so they subsidized fishing fleets, and that's why the fleet took off. So at this point, from this point on, basically all of the legal size male crabs get caught each year. Very intense fishery. The fishery has not crashed. It goes up and down, but it's never crashed. So it looks as if it's a sustainable fishery. And this appears to be because there appears to be a really excellent match between the biology of the crabs and the regulations. Male crabs are not fished until they're 4 years old, and they reach sexual maturity at 1.5 years. Hence, they have to mate before they enter the fishery. Male crabs mate with multiple females. Hence, even though there are far more males or female crabs than male crabs, all the female crabs are fertilized each year. And this has been measured in multiple studies. Female crabs are not taken in the fishery. Hence, even though it's an intense fishery, egg production is not impacted by the fishery at all. In addition, because the fishery uses traps, there's very little bycatch and little damage to the environment. There are problems, but I'm not going to go to the problems because I'm supposed to talk about the crab life history. Okay, so the eggs are released, or the eggs hatch in winter over the continental shelves. So we've got as a cartoon here, this is continental slope, this is the continental shelf, and this is land. And the blue line is the surface of the ocean. At the time they are released, there's a current called the Davidson current, and it is flowing northward into the board. That's why this little X is here. Winds are into the board as well. The winter winds are blowing to the north. Off the continental shelf, the California current is flowing to the south. As the larvae develop, they're released here in the Davidson current, so they're getting wide northward. And as they go through their development, they steadily move further and further offshore and eventually end up off the continental shelf in the California current, and then they're getting a ride south. So the net effect is that they get a ride north, and then they get a ride south, and if conditions are just right, they can settle right back into the population from which they were released. So I've been following the return of the megalopy for I guess it's about 20 years now, a long time. And basically, this is a measure of the larval success, because this is the number of megalopy, the last larval stage, that get back to the shore. And I've been making measurements here in Coos Bay, at that dot right there. And I'm using this very complex gadget here. This is a light trap. It's got a light in the side, and then there's a sea water. The crabs are very strongly attracted to light. They swim towards the light, find the funnel, swim inside, and they get stuck. And so every day we go out and pull the trap and count the number of megalopy that we caught. And we do this from the beginning of April through September, which is the period of time when they return back to the Oregon coast. This is what a daily data set for a year looks like. This is last year, 2020. They started coming in at very low numbers in April, and around the beginning of May, they just came in gangbusters with tens of thousands caught per day. It's very pulse delivery, you know, so it's very few and then a whole mess, and then very few and then a whole mess. And then as you move along, usually in most years, around about July, the numbers fall off. And eventually when you get to September, they poop out. So in 2020, we caught 161,000 megalopy. This is what the data looks like over the roughly 20 years that I've been doing it. This is time is years, vertical axis is number of megalopy caught from April through September, and it's a log scale. The first 5 years of data, this was supported by NOAA, and then I didn't have any money, so I didn't collect any data. And then from 2006 onward, the research has been supported by the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission. And what you see is that low catches are down around a bit more than 1,000 to several thousand. Those occurred during years of strong El Niños. And then high years are somewhere around 2 million. So over the 20 years, what we've got is the number of megalopy returning to shore is varied by a factor of 1,000 years. A huge variability. So what drives that? Several things. One is whether there's a strong El Nino or not. During strong El Ninos, there's a low catch. So why would that occur? It's because during a strong El Nino, you've got strong northward flow. So what's happening is the megalopy are released into the winter continental shelf currents, and they get a really big ride to the north. And they probably go all the way north of Vancouver Island up into Southeast Alaska. And they actually are papers that have described larvae showing up in Southeast Alaska when they shouldn't be there because the population of adults spawn much later there. Then the second thing is whether the PDO index is negative, indicating that more water is flowing south in the California current. So that's what this graph has got here. This is the summed PDO index from January to July. And PDO stands for Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And basically what it is a measure of how much of that west wind drift water has come towards the California current versus going into the Gulf of Alaska. And when more comes our way, the California current is colder, and that's what the negative values are. It's the temperature is cooler in the California current. And then the vertical axis in this graph is the number of returning megalopy during the recruitment season. And notice it's a log scale. And so roughly 36% of the variability, the annual variability is driven by just the PDO. And then the third thing is the day of the year, the spring transition. And the earlier the spring transition, the bigger the catch. The spring transition is the date when the winter winds tend to shift to the summer winds. So winds go from being predominantly from south to north to predominantly north to south. And that tends to occur on average about mid-April. If it happens earlier, we get a bigger catch. If it happens later, we get a smaller catch. And then the other thing is the amount of upwelling during the summer. More upwelling, we get a bigger catch. So we've got here in this graph down here, in the lower right, is day of the year, the spring transition. This is day of the year here. And then vertical axis is number of megalopi returning. And the data falls out into two clusters. One, years when we caught around 100,000 or less megalopi. And that's one line. And then the other line is this one up here with the open circles where we caught more than 100,000 megalopi. And the two data sets are different for sure. And they explain this one variable explains roughly 45% of the variability, something like that. Why it falls out into two lines like this, I am not sure. Okay, so the reason the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission has supported my work for, I guess it's 15 years or more now, is because knowing the number of megalopi that return to shore, I can actually predict the size of the commercial catch 4 years later. The 4 years being how long it takes a megalopi to grow up into an adult crab big enough to be caught. And so that's what these data are here. What we've got is horizontal axis is the number of megalopi caught per year or per settlement season, the log of that. So this is roughly 1,000, and this would be 1,000,000. And then the vertical axis is the log of the commercial catch in metric tons. And we've got two graphs again. So the solid squares are years where there was less than 100,000 megalopi returning to shore. And then the open circles are when there was more than 100,000 megalopi returning to shore. So the data falls out like this. There's nothing, and I'm not absolutely positive why this is the case. I can speculate. And what I think is happening is these events are affecting how many megalopi settle to the bottom and then survive through that initial recruitment year to become adult crabs. In these years here, where we get 100,000 or less megalopi returning to shore, my guess is that the number of those intense settlement events is 1 to several. And here, where we've got more than 100,000 animals settling per year, the number of intense recruitment events, settlement events, I don't know, they could be every time. These big pulses of megalopi tend to occur twice a month. So we could have 10 or so. And remember, these guys are really cannibalistic. So the more that settle, the more predation on the new recruits because they eat each other. So this difference may be simply due to the number of those intense recruitment events. That's a hypothesis, not a proven fact. You'll notice that there's two data points here that have little X's, and those are listed as marine heat waves. And so in both cases, I predicted that the commercial catch was going to be down here or down here. And my prediction was way off. So why was it way off? I mean, because all these others, I'm great at predicting. So these data points being so out of line is trying to say something. It's telling us something about the way the world is working. And it's a marine heat wave. And during the marine heat wave, the water's warmer. The baby crabs should be growing more rapidly. So my guess, the hypothesis, is that what's happening is that these guys are growing rapidly through the extremely dangerous period when they're tiny and moving out of that into a bigger size class where they're safer. Hence, more of them make it to recruitment and more of them make it into the fishery. Now, you might be thinking, oh, great, marine heat waves are a good deal for crabs. I'm not sure, because the other thing that happens with warmer water is the number of eggs that successfully mature and become larvae decreases as the temperature goes up. And so during these marine heat waves, the water temperature was about 12 degrees C, which is high enough that it could have been impacting the egg development. So the number of larvae produced could have been smaller. if the temperature gets up, I think it's 15, above 15 degrees C, that's it. The eggs don't develop. So if the water gets too warm, that's that. All right. So I hope you all found out this is an interesting talk. If you're interested in reading some of the papers upon which this talk was based, you can send me an email request and I'll send you a bunch of PDF files. So name's Alan Shanks, and I've got a complex email address, ashanks@uoregon.edu. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That's yay. It's very complicated. It's something that, as a person who grew up in Coos Bay, I wasn't aware of a lot of this. So thank you so much for that.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. Yeah, and take him up on your questions if you need to. Okay, let's move down to California now. And Tracy Grimes, San Diego State University, has been involved in looking at these issues, Dungeness crab and sea otter interactions. And so let's hear from the California scene as to what's going on. Tracy, thank you.
All right, let me get the screen up and going. All right, does that look okay?
Looks good.
All right. So thank you for inviting me to talk tonight, Elakha Alliance. It's been a while since I've been able to talk about sea otters and their effects on Dungeness crab. I just want to take a moment to thank all my co-authors listed here as well. This really was a group effort. This research was done for my master's thesis down at San Diego State, as Bob indicated. So before I dive into the dynamics of otters and Dungeness crab, I first just want to touch briefly on sea otters as a top predator. So this is one of the most commonly used examples of a trophic cascade. And this comes from sea otters in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. So in this example, sea otters consume sea urchins, and this reduces grazing pressure off of kelp. So islands where that were associated with sea otters or where otters were present, there tends to be more kelp and just an overall more productive ecosystem. Islands where otters were absent, they tended to see more of an urchin-barren ecosystem, less productivity in those areas. So otters could really alter the entire community structure just by consumption of their prey, by just reducing the overall abundance of the prey. But they could also alter the size and biomass of their prey by picking off the larger individuals and kind of leaving the smaller, maybe less calorie-rich individuals behind. So otters, like many other predators, really have these large impacts on prey and the communities they live. And oftentimes this is a beneficial impact. And this really is a conservation problem because, like other predators, sea otters were also affected by human influences. So because otters have the densest fur of any mammals, they were hunted to near extinction. They did gain protection when the first seal treaty was signed, but the population in California was actually thought to be extinct for quite a while until a remnant group of otters down in that bottom picture there, super cool old photo of some otters. They were discovered off of the Big Sur coast in central California. And they remain protected today under the Endangered Species Act, as well as the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Here in California, we have a subspecies called the southern sea otter, and they range from just south of San Francisco to approximately Santa Barbara. This population has been pretty slow to increase over the past 25 years, and sea otter biologists have kind of identified that the population needs to expand their range or be reintroduced into other estuaries in order to bolster that population growth. So the good news is that California otters are on their way to recovery, albeit slowly. The bad news here is that oftentimes this could create direct conflict with humans since they're competing for some of the same resources. So otters, as we know, have pretty expensive taste in seafood, at least some of them do. And this has created conflict with several invertebrate fisheries in the past. In particular, we're talking about Dungeness crab tonight. There's examples of this from Southeast Alaska where this was a problem, but I won't go into that because I know Dr. Ginny Eckert's gonna touch on that more. But in California, the Dungeness crab fishery is highly valued. It's one of the most valued fisheries in California some years. And like Dr. Shanks was saying, this fishery, they basically fish out all the males that are legal size each year. So it really relies kind of on the annual recruitment of juveniles. And these juveniles is the size class I was primarily focusing on during my research in California. And these juveniles can use estuaries as what we call nursery habitat. So just a little bit more background on that. So as Dr. Shanks was saying, Dungeness crab have this complex life history. During their last larval stage, they can migrate into an estuary and settle. And they can stay there until they reach approximately sexual maturity. Oftentimes, at least in Central California, they won't stay in the estuary as an adult. They'll move back out to the ocean and become part of the fishery class and potentially get caught in the fishery. So estuaries are considered nursery habitat because the Dungeness that use them typically grow bigger and faster than if these juveniles would have settled just on the open coast. And within estuaries, as Dr. Shanks also mentioned, they use a variety of habitat types. So this includes seagrass, mudflat, sandy bottom, oyster reefs are really important habitat, as well as rocky areas. And our other player in this story, sea otters, they also use estuaries. This isn't our typical view of sea otters. I think we, normally see them in kelp forest, and that's just kind of the image that's burned into all of our minds. But they did historically occupy them. This is documented in this book by Adele Ogden. And they currently are using seagrass and marsh habitat, at least in California. And these areas are really going to be important for sea otter growth, population growth in California. So as otters start to recolonize some of these estuaries that used to be their home, it's really going to be important to consider the magnitude of these indirect benefits that they could provide, such as providing additional habitat for juvenile crabs, such as Dungeness crab, while also kind of weighing these negative effects, such as their direct consumption of those very same species. So I'm going to break this research up into two parts. The first part is looking at one estuary where both of these species overlap in California. This is Elkhorn Slough. So looking at the effects of sea otters on that Dungeness crab population in Elkhorn Slough. And then the second part, I'll kind of zoom out and we'll look at what the crab populations look like in a few different California estuaries, and also try to relate this back to the Dungeness crab fishery. So here's Elkhorn Slough. This isn't it's a pretty small estuary, but it's actually the second largest estuary in California, second to San Francisco Bay, which is the largest. And it lets out into the center of Monterey Bay. It also hosts the highest concentration of sea otters in California. So the otters in Elkhorn Slough, they first colonized in the 80s. However, they didn't really get established in this area. It was a small raft of a few males. But in the early 2000s, the Monterey Bay Aquarium started to release rescued pups. And at that time, breeding started. So from the probably early 2000s up until about 2013, the population grew pretty rapidly and has remained pretty stable in more recent years. We also know from recent, well, maybe not so recent anymore, recent when I was doing my research. So research from Hughes and colleagues, sea otters are indirectly benefiting seagrass growth and expansion in Elkhorn Slough. And they do this in a trophic cascade similar to that kelp forest example I showed in the beginning of this talk, just a few extra levels, and it does involve crabs such as Dungeness in there. We also know from diet analysis from that time when sea otters were really getting established in Elkhorn Slough that the majority of their diet composed of cancer crabs, which is the group that Dungeness crab is in. So since Dungeness crabs seem to be an important component of the otter diet, I really wanted to look at how this Dungeness crab's juvenile population in this estuary had changed between this period when, you know, otters were really getting established here, and as their population kind of was stabilizing or reaching maximum carrying capacity. So to do this, we first characterized sea otter occurrence. So in Elkhorn Slough, we had a huge collaborative effort for several years between all these agencies. And observers would go out into the slough with spotting scopes and mark the location of otters throughout the estuary, as well as their behavior. So using these scopes, you could see if an otter is resting or grooming or foraging. You could even get more detailed data on what they're consuming, because sea otters are so lovely as a study species. They bring all their prey items up to the surface to consume. And so observers could see what the otters are eating and sometimes get estimates of the size of what they're eating as well. So this really gives us a snapshot of where the otters are and what they're doing throughout the estuary. To get data for crab, specifically looking at crab abundance and the sizes of crabs, I set traps throughout the estuary where they were known to occur from past research. And I set these traps in seagrass and mudflat or sandy habitat, just on kind of bare unvegetated habitat. Those are kind of the two habitat types that Dungeness crab use that exist in Elkhorn Slough. All right, so what I first want to show you is between 2012 and 2016, we really saw this shift in where sea otters were foraging. So this map on the left is from 2012. Hot color, this is a heat map, so hot colors indicate higher density and cooler colors indicate less density. But what you could really see is in 2012, sea otters were really kind of centered around this bend in the estuary we call the Seal Bend. By 2016, it had really become more dispersed and a little bit more evenly distributed throughout the entire estuary. So when we look at this in comparison with crab data, we really saw that Dungeness crab abundance declined over and this coincided with an increase in sea otter density. So this is on the x-axis here, foraging sea otter density, and then Dungeness crab abundance here. And you could see just from the raw data points, the green is 2012. They were catching more Dungeness crab, and by 2016, all these orange dots, it was really hard to get any. They were just a lot less abundant by that time period. So we saw a similar shift in crab size. As I said, there's pretty much only juveniles in this estuary. But in 2012, the median was 53, and by 2016, this had shifted over to 42 millimeters. So we saw both a decline in abundance and size between those two time points, and it seems to have coincided or been correlated with sea otter activity in the slough. When we looked at how the effect of habitat played into this, saw a really interesting pattern. Dungeness crab were smaller in the unvegetated habitats. And this was also the areas where sea otters tended to forage more intensely. So this was really interesting to me, because in my mind, I think of seagrass as being kind of this protective habitat where small crabs would want to hang out, but we actually saw kind of this opposite effect. So to summarize this first part, we saw that juvenile Dungeness abundance and size declined between those two time points, and this was related to otter activity. So we think that otters may negatively be impacting the juvenile crabs in this estuary. We also saw that the smaller crabs coincided where otters were foraging. And this last part I didn't show, but there was a shift in the otter diet between before their population kind of stabilized and after. So I told you guys that it was about 43% of the otter diet composed of cancer crab. During the period where this study was done, 2013 to 2016, it had shifted to 3% cancer crab. So it really points to, it seems like otters basically have depleted crabs and truncated the size of those crabs that do exist there. All right, so zooming back out for the second part, so looking at this dynamic across several estuaries where otters are present and where they aren't. To introduce you to these study sites, our two northern sites are Drake Sestero and San Francisco Bay. These sites don't currently have otter populations, but they are potential sites in California for reintroduction. And Elkhorn Slough, as we've already discussed, has an established sea otter population. And then down to the south, Morro Bay, there is a population of sea otters there. However, it's similar to kind of to the early days of Elkhorn Slough, where they were primarily using kind of the area closer to the mouth of the estuary and not using the inside interior area as much. So this is just a shout out. We use the same methodology described earlier in all these estuaries, sampling for crab, and this was a huge effort. And I have all these people to thank from a variety of universities across the state of California, as well as the National Park Service from Point Reyes National Seashore and Drake Sestero. So to compare trends statewide for the Dungeness crab fishery and sea otter population, I collected data from 2000 to 2014 from CDFW statewide reports on Dungeness crab landings. And we also used USGS does an annual sea otter census. So I used those data as well. So what we saw when we looked at crab populations at those 4 estuaries, kind of a predictable pattern. The 2 sites with otters present had fewer crab caught, and then the sites where otters were absent, San Francisco Bay and Drake Sestero, we saw more crab. Same story with crab size. Morro Bay and Elkhorn Slough were significantly smaller crabs than San Francisco Bay and Drake Sestero. Drake Sestero being significantly higher than all the other estuaries that we sampled. So tying this back over to Dungeness crab fishery. So just looking at the landing data from across different regions in the state, you'll see there's quite a bit of variation, particularly in Eureka. And you'll also notice, or I should point out, the scales on these are all different. So some of these regions just tend to land more crab than others. So that's just something important to note. And other than that, you'll see from Bodega down to Morro Bay, there's been a general increase in Dungeness crab landings over time. So Monterey and Morro Bay were 2 regions where sea otters occur. So we used those landing data and correlated them with the otter population counts I mentioned earlier. And what we saw was actually a positive correlation, which wasn't totally to be expected. So this doesn't mean sea otters are helping Dungeness crab necessarily. Correlation does not mean causation, as we always say in statistics. But it does appear that they aren't negatively impacting the adult population. So sea otters are typically not deep divers of the marine mammal world. So depending on where the adult crabs occur, sea otters may not be impacting the adult population that the fishery is trying to catch. So we were interested to see how maybe their predation effects in these estuaries can eventually affect the fishery. So we did lag the time by 3 and 4 years to look at that. And that's the time it would take a juvenile Dungeness crab that settles in an estuary to be of the size to be legally caught in the fishery. And when we did that, both of those correlations, we didn't see any relationship really there, pretty much just a flat line. So, what this is saying is within Monterey and Morro Bay, at least, sea otters aren't negatively impacting the Dungeness crab fishery in those areas. But it is important to note Monterey and Morro Bay, Elkhorn Slough and Morro Bay are pretty small estuaries, and so the contributions of juvenile Dungeness crab from those estuaries to the region's fishery may not be that significant. This, might play out a little bit differently if sea otters were in San Francisco Bay, which has been called a critical nursery habitat that contributes a large portion of the annual crab stock to the fishery in that region. So to summarize this, we saw that crabs were more abundant and larger in those estuaries without otters. The second one I actually didn't show in this presentation, but we did look at some abiotic factors such as sea surface temperature, upwelling, salinity, different things that would impact crabs' recruitment and survival and growth. And there were some influences, but we really didn't see anything that explained the kind of obvious differences between the estuaries quite as otter presence did. So as I said, the otter population doesn't appear to negatively be impacting the Dungeness crab fishery in California at this time. Of course, this could potentially change depending on how the dynamic plays out if otters were to reoccupy or be introduced into San Francisco Bay. So that would just be something, someone else down the road could research, hopefully. Other than that, I really want to acknowledge most of my sea otter photos were taken from colleagues who are skilled scientists as well as skilled photographers. This research was also funded by several agencies, and it was a collaborative effort. Like, all the data collected was a huge collaborative effort from a lot of folks shown in these pictures as well. So thank you for listening. If you are interested in looking at that study in more detail, it is published in Marine Ecology Progress Series, and my email is listed there. If you have a hard time tracking it down, I'm always happy to send a PDF copy.
Tracy, thank you so much. That's excellent information, and good to know. If you have questions, make sure you write them out either in the Q&A tab down below or the chat. You can send them to everyone. So we're going to move north now to Alaska, and thank you, Jenny, for being with us tonight. I think you're 2 hours earlier than we are, right?
Just 1 hour.
Just 1 hour? Okay, great. Well, all right. Well, it's almost dinner time for you. So let's get going here, and we'll hear about what's going on in Alaska. Thank you.
Great. I'm working on sharing my screen. Okay.
Here we go. Looking good.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, Bob, for the invitation. And it's pretty interesting to share information from Alaska with you guys in Oregon. I need to definitely reveal that I did a sabbatical in Oregon in 2006, worked really closely with Alan Shanks, and I actually come into this sort of sea otter world from the crab side, from the shellfish side. I'm a professor of fisheries at the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences. It's at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm actually based in Juneau in Southeast Alaska. I've worked on a variety of different issues, and all the work that I'm going to talk to you today sort of falls into a project that I'm going to talk about called APECS. And so many different people have been involved. Here's a sort of snapshot of some of them. This is not all of them, and many of my past students, I'll be acknowledging them through many of these talks. This is a really big project, and the APECS stands for Apex Predators, Ecosystems, and Community Sustainability, because these questions are not straightforward. There are many different dimensions of them. So we acknowledge that sea otters are apex predators and humans are apex predators in these systems. We're looking at a variety of different systems. We're looking at seagrass systems and nearshore kelp systems. And we're looking at the people and the resources that they depend on. And so that's where sort of the shellfish and the crab story comes in. So as I said, this is a complex question. This is a social ecological question. And the humans really are a key player in this whole system. They exert very strong influence, and in fact, that's where the story starts. As Tracy already mentioned, sea otters were hunted, and in Southeast Alaska, they were hunted to extinction. So they were completely absent from Southeast Alaska as a result of the fur trade for at least 100 years. We think potentially a lot more than that. So in their absence, the things that sea otters like to eat, all these tasty shellfish that we like to eat too, increased in abundance. And shell fisheries developed as a function of these high abundances of shellfish. So let me tell you the story about the release of sea otters. I'm going to focus in Southeast Alaska, which is this tiny little tail that sticks off the side. The people in Canada think it should be part of Canada, which Canada is very close. There were 7 release sites, so I've highlighted them here throughout Southeast Alaska. And sea otters, interestingly, were released from 2 different source populations. And that genetic diversity actually has probably led to their success. There were on the order of 400 animals released. I'm going to zoom in on the southern area, and that's actually where I'm speaking to you from today. This is one of our major study sites. This is Prince of Wales Island. It is the 3rd largest island in the United States after Kodiak Island and the big island of Hawaii. So it's quite a big area where we're working. There are 2 release sites here, and I'm going to sort of zoom in on those 2 areas in the next slide. So I've sort of zoomed in here, and the 2 release sites are circled in red, and then the abundance of sea otters over time. So this is going back to 1968 when the sea otters were initially released. They were at low density. And as I click through this, we go to 1975, the densities stay about the same. The sea otters actually migrated out to this little island out here called Coronation Island initially, but didn't move very far. By 1983, their densities are increasing at that north site and then at Coronation Island, the other place where they colonized. By the late 80s, you can see they've increased in abundance in a few different places. Coronation Island is an important place. And they've also expanded from that northern release site. They haven't expanded very much at all from the southern release site. By 2003, that northern release site, they've expanded quite a bit more. Still note that the densities at the southern site are still quite low. And then this is the most recent survey that we have, which if you look, it's about 10 years old. So in 2010-11 was the last aerial survey in Southeast Alaska. And you can see that some of these places have quite high densities of sea otters. And this is the point at which we're starting to see quite a few interactions among different commercially important fisheries, that these shell fisheries. So sea otters eat crab. You guys know that. I don't have to tell you that. Let me show you the information that we gathered on the foraging data of these sea otters when they were sort of migrating into these new areas. So this was work that Zach Hoyt did for his PhD. And from 2009 to 2011, we saw that 46% of the sea otter diet was commercially important species. I've highlighted Dungeness crab here, relatively small proportion of the biomass. It's actually an energetically important part of the otter diet though, because Dungeness crab are so energetically important, or they're so energy rich, right? Sea urchins are their favorite thing. They love sea urchins. If they're there, they'll eat those. They also eat geoduck clams, sea cucumbers, pinto abalone, and king crab. All these are commercially important, and a variety of other things too. The bulk of their diet in many places can be clams. So this is the overall picture across all the different areas that we studied, looking across that entire sort of area of southern Southeast Alaska. What I'm going to do now is show you some diet data from tagged individuals that were at a location that sea otters had just colonized. So this is still in that same time period, and I grouped so each of these lines is an individual sea otter, and then I've grouped them by sex and by type of animal. So the females segregate from the males, So the females are shown here in pink, and then I've highlighted how much of the different things they're eating. Now, the females often have pups, they're hanging out in reefs, so they don't tend to hang out in the habitat that has many Dungeness crab. The territorial males, which are the dark blue, those guys are hanging out with the females. So their diets are actually pretty darn similar to the females. The non-territorial males, these are sort of the gangs of juveniles, we would sometimes call them. They're the ones that are cruising to new habitats, and they're the ones that are eating Dungeness crab in higher abundances, which is pretty interesting that we're seeing this sort of like size, sex relationship, and diets are changing. And it's because the nature of, the females are hanging out by the reefs, but these juveniles are foraging into new areas, and they're exploiting Dungeness crab in particular. I'm going to focus on a few other species as well, just because I want to give you a bit more. It's not just about Dungeness crab. We've looked at the sea cucumber, and this is the commercially important sea cucumber, which here I've showed you a picture of it. One of the things that's really nice is that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game does surveys for sea cucumbers. And so looking at their survey data, what we did is we looked and said, okay, well, are sea otters in a place? No, if they're not in a place, then we find many more sea cucumbers than when sea otters have colonized. And if they colonized earlier, we find that the abundance of sea cucumbers decreases drastically. Now, one point to make here is that these are diver surveys where people dive, and this is within the diving depth of sea otters as well. Now, sea otters can definitely dive deeper than people can. And it's possible that there could be a depth refuge here that we're not picking up. But largely the story is that the sea otters can decrease the abundance of sea cucumbers, particularly to available dive fishermen. If we look at geoduck clams, so geoduck clams are a popular food item. Geoducks are fascinating. The data there, they do surveys, but they only do surveys at much longer intervals. So what I'm showing you here is the abundance of geoducks in this bottom right panel. The abundance of geoducks, and we're looking before and after sea otters show up in a place. And we looked in places where there are sea otters and places where there are not sea otters. And so we see declines in geoduck abundance without sea otters, but the decline is larger in areas with sea otters. So we think we're seeing an effect here, once again, on the, these dive fisheries, geoduck clams that are being affected. And the geoduck clam is highlighted there in that image. So what we saw, and this is sort of a synthesis of much of Zach's work, this is looking at the diversity of the sea otter diet and as a function of the years since sea otters have colonized. And so when they first show up to a place, their diet isn't very diverse. And then the diversity increases over time. And so the places that they are the longest are the places where they have the most diverse diets. The other thing that we saw was that commercial shell fisheries, particularly these dive fisheries, were present, but only in places where sea otters had occupied for less than 10 years. So that seemed to be a really critical threshold. Now, let me say that this is really focused on the dive fisheries. So what's going on with Dungeness crab, you might ask? So we don't have any fishery independent surveys. We've been looking at Dungeness crab abundance in eelgrass beds, and we see a very similar thing to what Tracy found, that when sea otters are absent, the crabs are much larger than when they're present. So we find small crabs in the presence of crabs. We find small crabs in the presence of sea otters. And then this maybe is the picture that you guys want, but you'll see I actually don't have the answer for you. So what we did here is we looked at the Dungeness crab catch over time and then overlaid the sea otter population in Southeast Alaska. So doing this up to that last survey in 2010. And as you can see, the Dungeness crab fishery goes through these population cycles. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. And so if you sort of stop at 2010, the sea otter population is increasing. You might say, oh, that Dungeness crab population is decreasing. Is there a relationship there? Well, looking at what's happened since then, now we don't have a sea otter survey. So these red lines are maybe what's going on with sea otters, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Maybe focus on these bars here. So what we saw, the sea otter, the Dungeness crab catch decreased, but then it increased, then it decreased again, and then it increased. So the last several years have seen banner Dungeness crab catches in the presence of a pretty well-established Dungeness crab population in Southeast Alaska. There is a survey that's planned this year to survey the sea otter population, which will help us to understand, has the sea otter population increased exponentially along that same trajectory that it was following before, or has the sea otter population stabilized? Well, we could all definitely make bets on what we think is going on. What I would say is going on, actually, based on the work that we've been doing, is that the sea otter population has not continued upon this exponential trajectory. In fact, I think it's stabilized quite a bit as a function of two things. One, that they have exploited a lot of food in many of the areas they've colonized. And then the other thing is that there's sea otter hunting that's happening here in Southeast Alaska. The other thing that I'll point out, and this is going to be the project for one of my PhD students, is that there's a complex relationship, like Alan Shanks showed, with recruitment of Dungeness crab. And so these cycles might be driven by oceanographic processes, and the predators might not be driving or regulating the system. The other thing that we'll be looking at is how much do the sea otters actually overlap with the areas where the fishery is harvesting crab. So as I mentioned, sea otters are harvested here, so they're actively hunted. Coastal Alaskan natives can legally hunt sea otters. I'm showing you data here in the far bottom right. The red dots are the harvests. And so the number of sea otters that get harvested kind of scales with the population size. So as there are more otters get hunted. And we think that is having an effect on the population at local scales, but probably isn't having an effect on the population over the whole Southeast Alaska wide scale. So as Tracy mentioned, sea otters have a really rich ecological role. I haven't touched on much of that. Our APECS project is getting at many of these different pieces. And we've been looking at that ecological role of the sea otters in the seagrass systems. Here's a little snapshot look at that. We do see more seagrass in areas with sea otters. The relationship is complex though, and there's a really interesting dynamic that I'm not going to go into now, but this work is published and I'd be happy to share the paper with you later. And so I think, as you embark upon thinking about reintroducing sea otters into Oregon, definitely think about that ecological role. I mean, are they going to have impacts on fish and, carbon budgets and all these other factors? With that, I will stop. I'd be happy to answer questions. Feel free to throw them in the Q&A or ask them at the end. And thank you for listening.
Jenny, thank you so much. Very interesting. Southeast Alaska is a whole nother world, and it's great to get a report from there, even if it's just a glimpse. Going to turn now to Tim Tinker, who has been Mr. Sea Otter all over the world. I think he's worked up in your neck of the woods. He's worked in California, just everywhere. And we're happy to have him leading our feasibility study effort. Tim, you want to unmute yourself and take over?
Sure thing. Okay, I'm going to see how sharing screen works with me.
Yeah, I think Tim's going to, at least I asked him to talk. I'm not sure what he's actually going to say. Nobody else. But
yeah. So yeah, I'm not sure what I'm going to say either. Actually, it's just after midnight here in Halifax, And 5 minutes ago, it became my birthday, in fact. So I'm a little,
Happy birthday, Tim.
so I might be a little bit out of it, but I will do my best to stay somewhat coherent. And I am, though, going to take a little tiny digression from crabs, only crabs, and talk a little bit about sea otters more. However, that's mainly so that we can get back to talking about crabs in the next talk. I'm going to sort of provide the bridge between the feasibility study and then leading up to the economic analysis that you're going to be hearing about in the next talk, which will once again get back to potential impacts on crabs. But I'm going to give you a little sort of a summary of where we are with the feasibility study. I'm going to focus primarily on one component of that study, but I'm going to try and give you an overview of everything. So as Bob said, we are working on a feasibility study for the reintroduction of sea otters to Oregon. And what goes into the feasibility study? So first of all, before I even talk about that, I'd like to make clear the feasibility study is not a proposal. In any way. In fact, it's really a precursor to, it's about several stages before a proposal would actually occur. It's really an initial investigation into what would be entailed with a sea otter reintroduction and some of the important considerations. And it's really an attempt to amass all the important and relevant information, much of which we've been hearing about in the earlier talks today, so that others, including all of you listening right now, the members of the community, the relevant stakeholders and decision makers can then evaluate all that information and decide whether proposing a sea otter reintroduction is indeed feasible. So what goes into the feasibility study? Some things are fairly obvious. The basic biology of sea otters is relevant to whether or not a reintroduction of sea otters to Oregon would be feasible. And by biology here, we include both population biology, behavior, also genetics, and genetic connectivity and diversity. And you heard a little bit about that before, about the fur trade effects in sea otters and how that brought them to near extinction and fragmented their remaining populations. And as a result, they lost a lot of genetic diversity. And one of the major barriers to gene flow between the northern and southern populations is the huge gap that occurs around the Oregon coast. So gene flow and basic demography are one of the major topics. We're also taking a close look at habitat and the suitability of the habitat, potential suitability of the habitat for sea otters, which varies quite a bit across coastal Oregon. The ecological effects that Jenny was just mentioning here and that you've heard about in all the talks really are really central and key considerations for the feasibility study. These ecological effects are very diverse and broad. You've heard about some of them. I'll talk about a few more of them, but in general, these the complex suite of effects, some of which are considered positive to people, some of which are considered negative to people. We're not trying to sugarcoat anything. We're trying to really amass all the information on the full suite of ecological effects, which include the direct consumptive effects on prey species, but also these indirect effects that can lead to increases in kelp and seagrass, for example. So those are sort of some of the scientific considerations, but there's a lot of other considerations that really are also critical to consider when evaluating something like a reintroduction of a species to an area. Social considerations are really important, and Jenny touched on some of those in Southeast Alaska example. These are not, these ecosystems that we're considering returning sea otters to are also occupied by people. And and people have developed economies and activities and traditions and cultures in the absence of sea otters. And so it's very relevant and important to consider those and how those social structures may be affected as if sea otters were to be returned. And one of the main considerations, or related to the social considerations, are economic considerations. And that's what you're actually going to be hearing about more in the next talk. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but suffice to say, if sea otters end up competing with some fisheries, like crab fisheries, for instance, that could clearly have a negative economic impact. At the same time, many of those indirect effects, and some of which you've heard about, increasing kelps and seagrass, which are important nursery habitats for a whole bunch of species, can lead to positive economic impacts. And then there's a whole bunch of other factors as well. Ecotourism, for instance, is one. And with increased kelp forest, you end up increased carbon sequestration, reduced wave energy, and protection of shorelines. There's a whole suite of sort of indirect effects that also may have economic consequences. So we're touching on all of those things. And then, of course, there are a suite of complex legal and political considerations that also have to factor in. And then practical logistical considerations. What would be the logistics of conducting sea otter reintroduction, and how would that work in the context of Oregon, the Oregon coastline, and various groups? So all of these things are being, we're compiling all the information that we can find about these things, synthesizing that information, trying to make it a bit more digestible. Although I know the meat grinder is probably not the best image to show when we're talking about digestible, but the general idea is it all goes together into helping to determine the overall feasibility of a potential reintroduction of sea otters. So that's what goes into the feasibility study. The authors of the study, Bob and the Elakha Alliance had initially asked me to take a lead on this study, and I got started and quickly realized this was way bigger than I could possibly do myself. So I brought in some friends. Some of the friends I brought in, James Estes, he was formerly with U.S. Geological Survey and then with University of California at Santa Cruz. And he has been a researcher on sea otters and their ecosystems for many decades now, was really one of the pioneers in understanding the effects of sea otters on coastal ecosystems in the North Pacific. So he also happened to be my PhD advisor sometime in the past, and we've collaborated on many projects over the years. So he luckily agreed to join in and help write some of the chapters. Another close colleague and friend from many decades, Jim Bodkin, also from U.S. Geological Survey, although he's also now retired, so he's an emeritus USGS. Well, he's actually up in Alaska right now doing field work, so he doesn't seem to realize he's retired. He has worked on sea otters again for many decades, mostly in Alaska, although he got started in California. Sean Larson is a colleague of ours from Washington. She's I guess chief biologist and has several titles, I guess, at the Seattle Aquarium. She specializes particularly in genetic studies, and so she's taking the lead on the genetics portion, but also has helped out with several other chapters. And Dr. Mike Murray is the lead veterinarian from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and is really one of the foremost experts on sea otter health in the world. He's worked with us on all of the field projects that we've done, up and down the coast, from Russia to Alaska to California. So has extensive experience in the field, but also is really a leader in sea otter health issues. So he's taken a lead on those components. And then finally, Dr. Jan Hodder, formerly of the University of Oregon. I guess Jan is also retired now. I find that retired people have more time to really work on these things. And so Jan has really provided our anchor into the Oregon coast and Oregon ecosystems, the rest of us being outsiders, I guess, as it were. So Jan has really helped out with the taking the lead on the habitat considerations. With the exception of Jan, all the rest of us have worked together for many years and are also wrote various chapters in the Sea Otter Conservation book. So I'm going to give you a super quick rundown of the chapters. I've talked about all the topics, so I'm not actually going to do anything other than just introduce the chapters. So introduction, Chapter 2 is a history of past translocations. There have been quite a few in the past, and they've actually proved to be probably the most important single management action that's been taken that has underlaid the incredible successful recovery of sea otters from their almost extinction. Jim Boggin took the lead in that chapter and is understanding the history of past translocations and reintroductions. It's really important in terms of taking away lessons learned from both successful and unsuccessful translocations to hopefully provide some guidance in how to make future reintroductions successful. Population and demographic considerations, I took the lead in that chapter. Genetic and historical considerations, Sean Larson took the lead in that chapter. Ecosystem considerations, that was led by Jim. Habitat suitability, as I mentioned, was led by Jan Hodder, with contributions from myself and Jim Boggin, and also Dominique Cohn, who's a former student at Oregon State University. I actually just talked to him yesterday. He was the lead author also, as well as his master's, on a paper that's published in Endangered Species Research on the habitat suitability in Oregon for sea otters. Socioeconomic considerations, several of us are working on that, and that chapter sort of provides a lead into the more focused economic impacts assessment that Shannon is going to be talking to you about shortly. And then chapter 8, administrative and legal considerations. Sean and myself have drafted that with input from Michelle's, which is from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and others as well, who are more expert on the various complex administrative and legal considerations. Logistics and implementation, health and welfare considerations, and stakeholder perspectives, and then tie it all together with conclusions. So very soon, a completed second draft of all these chapters will be available for public review. So we're definitely closing in on that now, and Bob may be able to tell you a little bit more about that at the end. So a key component of many of these chapters is the ability to sort of think about what a sea otter reintroduction would look like in Oregon, in both over time, say over the next 25 to 35 years. If otters were introduced to different places, what would population growth and range expansion look like? Similar to the maps that Ginny just showed you for Southeast Alaska, otters may be put in one place, but over time their population is going to spread and it's going to increase in abundance. So what would that look like in Oregon? Projecting possible outcomes and alternative scenarios is really central to all facets of the study, to interpreting how viable a population might be in Oregon, interpreting what their ecological impacts might be, and socio and economic impacts as well, evaluating logistics. For all of these things, we need to have some way of evaluating what a reintroduction might look like. So we need this to be scientifically sound, but also ideally accessible and understandable, so that not just scientists can evaluate these things, but really everybody can. And so with that in mind, we have developed an Oregon-specific sea otter population model that we call ORSO, and we have given it a web-based interface that, although there are many dials and switches, really anybody who knows how to operate a dial or a switch can operate. To understand what those dials and switches are doing, you have to do a little bit of reading, but really we've tried to make this model as user accessible as we possibly can. So this is what the web interface looks like. If you go to that tool, you'll see some instructions that you can read to sort of give you an idea of how to approach. And then if you really want to dig in, you can download the user manual, which tells you in great detail about what every different dial and switch does and how it works. But in general, you use the simulation model to explore potential outcomes of a reintroduction of sea otters to the Oregon coast. Instructions are provided, as mentioned, and some of the things that you would select would be, for starters, you'll notice that here's the map of Oregon. We've broken it up into the south, central, and north because, well, Oregon is so tall and skinny, we couldn't fit it in one single map. And you'll notice that we have broken the coastline up into these sort of coastal segments. I forget how many there are in total, but there's quite a few. And the idea is you can choose from this drop-down box the coastal segments that you might want to be introducing sea otters to in your hypothetical scenario. You can then choose the number of otters to be added to that coastal section. And yes, you can select more than one coastal section. I'll talk about that in a bit. And then you can choose numbers of otters that you might want to add in subsequent years as supplemental introductions. And then there's a whole bunch of other options, and the options sort of disappear down the page here, that you can set to evaluate how those different variables will affect the outcomes in terms of the expected behavior of the population over the subsequent time period of it. And you can actually choose what that time period is. Here you could, for instance, set the dial to 25 years or 50 years. So under the hood of this model, there's a whole bunch of matrix algebra, plus a lot of data from studies of sea otter populations that we've conducted all over. So this includes some of the data, for instance, from Southeast Alaska populations, from Prince William, that Ginny just talked about, from Prince William Sound, studies in Washington, California. We have collected lots of data on tagged otters. You can see this one here. And actually, Ginny just showed you some of the dietary data from tagged otters. So by tagging otters and following them over time, we can collect as well as dietary data, detailed information on reproductive and reproductive output, survival rates, and a whole bunch of other things that you need to parameterize a model like that. I'm just showing you this for one little glance into the hood. You don't have to think about that or worry about it beyond that, unless you're interested in that sort of thing, in which case you can keep looking under the hood. So what does the model do? So you set all those various settings that you saw in that previous slide, and then you hit run, and then you maybe go get a coffee and wait, and it runs a whole bunch of different simulations given the options that you have selected. And the outcome of all those simulations that run are sort of summarized in this band. You can see sort of the central line shows you what the mean or average simulation did. And this is showing, for instance, showing you this graph in here on the right shows you estimated sea otter abundance over time from whenever you start the simulation to sometime in the future. So we were running these, I think, for a 25-year period. The gray band, though, shows you the distribution of all the other simulations. So we could just run one simulation, and it might, show the population growing from 40 animals up to 200 animals. But then you run a second simulation, and it shows the population actually shrinking down to only about 20 animals. So, and then you run another simulation, it'll be somewhere in here. So but that's why we run not one simulation, but very many simulations. And it's the distribution of those results that we should be interested in. That sort of shows us what our degree of uncertainty is about what might happen in the future. And that's scientists are really interested in uncertainty because the world is full of it, full of uncertainty, that is. And so we want to make sure that we're being very clear that we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But when you do different options, you can see what the range of results looks like. And on the left hand here is another way. So this shows you how the population changes in abundance over time. The map shows you what the distribution will look like at the end of the simulation. So after 25 years, if otters were reintroduced here, you can see their relative density and how far they've spread to the north and south of the coast. So that's sort of the basic inputs and outputs of the model. And I'm going to give you a quick run through of 4 different scenarios that we evaluated. And these 4 different scenarios are not by any stretch of the imagination the only things that could be done. They were, however, 4 scenarios that we thought were reasonable starting points and that are forming the basis of the economic impacts assessment that you're going to be hearing about next. So simulations or scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4 are places where we are going to release some number of otters. And the actual numbers of otters we're releasing under these scenarios actually varies. What our target was to determine how many otters would need to be released under each of these scenarios to end up with an average of 200 sea otters after 25 years. So let's run through these here. The scenario 1, real brief. This shows you projected sea otter population over 25 years. And a common feature you'll notice for all of these is over the first 10 years or so, the population actually shrinks. And this actually corresponds to what we've seen In most reintroductions that have been followed closely over the first decade, the population either hardly grows at all or actually may shrink, or it actually may shrink to complete, shrink to extinction, in fact, in some cases. And this is what we call the establishment phase of the population. Once the population becomes established after about a decade or so, then sort of the growth resumes, and then you can actually see quite rapid growth after that. So there's the Rogue Reef scenario. There's the Port Orford scenario. Again, you'll see the maps on the left. The outcomes are different depending on where the otters are released. This is the Coos Bay, Cape Arago, and I really apologize for any pronunciations that I'm mangling for Oregon place names, but again, I remind you it's after midnight and it's my birthday, so you have to be patient. And here's scenario 4, Yaquina Bay. I'll go with that, and Otter Rock release sites. So different outcomes, generally similar trajectories, although as you'll see in a minute, the actual the details of those trajectories differ a little bit, but overall the same general patterns you see. One of the things we can look at is how the probability of success of the translocation would vary with the number of otters introduced. So if you, for instance, were to reintroduce a total of 40 otters, that population could grow to maybe 50 after 25 years, but it could also shrink to extinction, and there's actually a high probability that it would do that. And in fact, these are the 95% sort of confidence intervals. If you want to be, or actually in this case, it's the 90%. If you want to be 90% sure that the population is not going to shrink to extinction, then you probably want to release at least 80 animals if we're looking at a single release site. And this is just showing you how how many initial otters would be needed to achieve your target of 200 otters in 25 years for the different scenarios. And as you can see, those numbers differ depending on the scenario. So the Port Orford release site requires the fewest initial release animals to have achieved 200 animals after 25 years. And this is actually just showing you how the numbers of otters expected after 25 years varies if you were to release otters at any one of the coastal segments from the south of Oregon up to the very north end. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of variation. The highest there is that Port Orford area, but there's several areas that you have sort of higher expected successes in terms of numbers of otters after 25 years. We also evaluated expected performance for multiple release sites versus single release sites. And as Ginny just explained to us, in Southeast Alaska, there were actually 7 release sites, and those 7 release sites are largely the reason that the overall meta population, that is all the whole regional population for Southeast Alaska, grew so fast, is that it wasn't growing from just a single node, it was growing from 7 nodes. And that turns out to be really important. So multiple release sites can achieve faster overall growth, although of course, if you're concerned about ecological impacts, that also is spreading out their potential ecological effects as well. And again, this is just showing you that multiple release sites can achieve about twice the expected abundance and lower risk of failure as compared to releases at a single site. Okay, so the results of these simulations are being used to guide potential selection of sort of the optimal reintroduction strategies, and not just locations, but also strategies for numbers of animals and how that might be spread out over time, and also forming the basis for assessing ecological and economic impacts that you're going to be hearing about next. And I think that's all I have, so I'm going to turn it over to the next speakers.
Fabulous. Thank you, Tim. I know that was a fast run through everybody, but we wanted to show you our homework at least and let you see kind of what is going on behind the scenes to try to get us to some good estimates of what might happen and how it might occur. We're going to move now to Shannon Davis, who's going to, and perhaps Hans, if he's still with us, are going to talk about the economic impact assessment that they've been working on. They needed these scenarios, these 4 scenarios that Tim just described, so that they could then project forward that if there were X number of animals in these various locations, what might the impact be on commercial crab catch? What might it be on other sectors of the economy? So those scenarios are important for the economic impact assessment. You know, clearly none of this stuff is reality. It's all modeling and best guesses, but we believe we've got the right people in the room to help us think this thing through. So Shannon and Hans, take it away.
All right, thank you. Share screen.
And while we're waiting, I want to thank everybody for hanging in. You know, we started the evening with 36 people. We're down to 33. So I want to thank everybody for hanging in. This is going a little longer than we thought, but there's a lot of information and I appreciate your sticking with us.
And it's my screen shared.
Yep.
All right.
You're good to go.
Yeah, a little introduction here. Like Tim, I didn't want to attack this project on my own. I brought in Hans Radke, and he's going to be speaking here a little bit. Hans and I have worked together for too many years, maybe going on 30. Lots of projects in Oregon, but also Alaska, and really around the world on a variety of fishery management projects. We took this one on. It kind of fits our background for modeling. I'm the modeler and researcher, and Hans is helping out a lot on concepts and talking me through how this reintroduction may affect human welfare. I really appreciate his advice. I don't want to tell him one-on-one. It's too much after 30 years to try to do that. We were guided a lot in our approach from the Greger study in British Columbia. He had, in that study, he did not look at all of the social and economic valuations on the plus and minus sign, but he did look at 4 important ones that will help decision makers on a go, no-go. We wanted to pattern our approach after his good work up there. That's not to say we're going to bring in other studies. There's a fair bit of literature on socioeconomic impacts of not only sea otters, of course, but other keystone species that we can draw from. So that's what you'll see in this little measurement block. And we're on the tail end of this presentation. As usual, economists have to look at the biologist output. We're at the tail end of the feasibility study, and we're still in the middle of a lot of our modeling. But there is one aspect of our work that I think it's important to the participants here tonight. I want to get into that a little bit of detail. And then I'll talk a little bit about the approach we're going to use on looking at some other ecosystem values that are going to be coming, or services that are going to be coming from this reintroduction if it occurs. This is a chart that I always like to bring up. Just because there's a $ sign in front of the number doesn't mean that it's measuring the same thing. it drives me a little bit crazy to read in media a number that doesn't have an adjective or an adverb or an explanation associated with what that value means. Even what we try to put out probably doesn't have enough explanation of what a dollar sign means, but we do our best. So tonight I'm going to be talking a little bit about our findings measuring regional economic impacts to the economy. So that's a transactional amount. Something goes out of one person's pocket into another. And when they do that, it's going to create jobs. And those jobs are going to have a cascading effect throughout the economy. So what I'm talking about tonight does have the multiplier effect associated with potentially what's going to be at risk from the reintroduction of sea otters. The dollar signs over here are a bit more abstract, especially this concept of existence value. What would people pay just to have sea otters presence on the Oregon coast? You really have to get into some appreciable explanation of what those dollar values are. Economists think that those dollar values have meaning, and that gives us a license to go ahead and do the models and the surveys and the explanations for them. But in the end, it's quite an abstract concept. Still, the numbers are important, especially in comparison of what Tim explained is the logistics of getting the reintroductions going, and that could be used in a trade-off analysis on what may be best, not only on the biological side, but on the socioeconomic effects side. I'm going to turn this over to Hans. He's going to talk a little bit about our modeling over the years and how some of our models are going to be used in this project.
Thank you, Shannon. Yeah, I'm going to make this fairly quick. I just want to show what our models do produce. I started modeling the fishing industry back in the 1980s with a guy by name Bill Jensen, and because that fishing industry was just developing and basically booming, and they wanted to show how much they contribute. So they asked me to create this model. We called it Fisheries Economic Assessment Model, FEMA. And we use that same model then also to do the money flows, as Shannon says, the direct and how money is respent and so on, throughout the economy. And we, for example, for Lincoln County, we come up with the fishing industry doing about 10% of the total income. But notice in places, especially like the coast, transfers of basically Social Security and so on, retirement, are a very big part of that. And from that, then we go next slide, Shannon. Shannon has taken over these models now, and basically NIMS has also used a variation of our model, and the Pacific Fishery Management Council uses our model to evaluate proposed policy changes. But just notice one of the things that's very interesting on this is that we found, Shannon found, that, for example, in Newport, that the distant water fishery up in Alaska brings in just about as much money as a direct fishery does off the Oregon coast. So it's not just the catch that's important, it's where the money flows. That's what we try and show. And it's not just the commercial or use of a resource, direct use, that brings in money. I mean, it's also recreation. Even you may or may not use that resource, but it also will bring in job, it will bring in income, will bring in jobs, and that are important to local communities. Okay, and of course we can show this for every community. And rather than going on and on about the results, if you can read Shannon's reports, he does these biannually about the contribution of the commercial fishery and recreational fishery in Oregon. But we've also used that for things like people that come to the coast, if you can identify those people as coming to the coast for viewing whales, and maybe in the future viewing otters, that's just that income to somebody that's cooking lunch for visitors. It's just about as important to him as the fisherman who brings in fish. So all income impacts are about the same, all right? I don't, as an economist, this is just one measurement that we use, and it is no more important than any other measurement. What we call the non-market use, what people think they might spend, or what we think people are willing to spend. If done correctly, if the surveys are done correctly, if we get information, are just as important as a direct resource use. You don't have to eat something, you don't have to use something to contribute that income to that use. I think that's basically the introduction of what I wanted to say about the total modeling. Shannon, unless there's some question there, okay?
Okay. Back to me. Tim had this map up and he showed the 4 areas under consideration. So I'm going to skip over that. And here are the 4 areas. So what I'm going to be talking about is the baseline information about those 4 areas and looking at the fisheries that the areas are producing now, both from the ocean and the corresponding bays in the area, and not only for commercial fisheries, but recreational fisheries. And it could be why Bob contacted us to work on this study or not, but we're coming into it with a spatial model that was developed for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife that allows calculations such as this. Similar to Tim's model, there's a lot of dials and switches that you can make to adjust your assumptions of the area that you're looking at, as well as other influences on the creation of benefits out of certain areas. There's a lot under the hood, and there's a detailed manual developed so that I think anybody can use this model. It's becoming a little bit more wide knowing, and I think it'll have use in other management situations in the coming years. It's on its third iteration of update, and unfortunately, the budget wasn't sufficient on this last update to make it a web-based model. It was in the proposal, and it didn't make the cut. But maybe in the future, we can make it as convenient as using Tim's model. Right now, it's locked into Excel framework, and you have to know a little bit about Excel to run it, but I've made it as user-friendly as possible. Anyway, we're able to specify these 4 regions in the model, and the output is under various dollar values, including accessible value for the commercial, number of trips for recreation. But tonight, because these are side by side, I just want to express it in units of regional economic impacts. That is the income created in 1 year from these areas. So in this graph, it's the all fisheries. The next graph, I'm just going to show you the fisheries that are under the gun from the reintroduction. You can see, even in this graph, there's pretty wide difference between recreational REI created and commercial REI created for the 4 locations. Right, shifting to those fisheries that may be most impacted. Here's Dungeness crab and sea urchin. So the effects just under these 2 market species would be much higher out of the Port Orford, Cape Blanco region than other regions. But the commercial fisheries are largely on the ocean side, and the boundary I've used or adopted is the 20 fathom isobath. That's a little deeper than the typical feeding habits of sea otters, but I think it's reasonable because it takes in consideration short migration paths of the species that may end up in their diets. This next graph adds some more fisheries, and that's the commercial bay fisheries, whether it's mollusks or some other clams. And it also adds in our aquaculture industry that we have on the Oregon coast. The REI I'm expressing here, one of the advisors on my project wanted to point out maybe a lot higher. What I'm using is numbers released by ODA, and they have an assumption in there of oyster production converted to oyster value that may understate a bit of what that real value is. Going along in the economic impacts from our baseline. Here's recreational shellfish. This is not from serial data. It says 2019, but I'm just grabbing the most recent year of information that we have about crabbing and climbing trips. And there's some good work done by Justin Ainsworth before he moved up in the ODF&W world, that gives us the digging days, and by modeling that we can convert into regional economic impacts. The ocean crabbing, we have such an excellent assessment of ocean trips year by year. This is 2019 data. And something to point out is that most ocean recreational crabbing trips are in combination with finfish as target species. This isolates just what a crab fishing trip only may create in economic impacts. All right, putting all those fisheries together in a graphic, you can see that it is the Coos Bay region that is creating the most economic impacts, and aquaculture plays a big part of that. But there are also big recreational fisheries there to consider, as there is in the Yaquina Bay. So, you know, if it's only what may be at risk, you can see from this graph, the Port Orford and Rogue Reef areas are the lowest. But we have to combine this with other information on what might be the objectives to be evaluated using economic data. So as the feasibility study perks along, like cost of reintroduction and success rates that Tim has already mentioned, that can be combined with impacts to fisheries to come up with statistics to compare these alternatives. As part of our modeling, we are going to use diet data. We had a good review there of diet in Alaska. This is diet off of the Olympic Peninsula of a small population of sea otters, and the two are consistent, as is diet information out of California. So there's some confidence that when we do make the final forecast, there's going to be some validity in the numbers that we're coming up with. This is back to the Greger study. Here's the zero line on impacts to biomass. And of course, what the meeting all about tonight is on impacts to Dungeness crab. It's certainly, you know, on the negative side here, but on the positive side, the biological interactions with increased kelp and seaweed beds, there could be, and which was a good forecast out of the British Columbia paper by Greger, that there will be supplemental catch in other fisheries. So while some are going to be negative impacted. There's going to be some that are positively impacted. And I don't know how far I can go down on exploitation rates of increased abundances to get quantitative information. We'll go as far as we can, and but certainly discuss this phenomenon. So, in the sake of time, I don't want to get into too much of our approach on some of the other valuations that we're going to be looking at, but I think we have a handle on being able to at least characterize what might be the value of increased visitation that Hans was talking about. That is real money coming in from outside of an economy, being put in a local economy, and it's certainly something that can't be discounted. The difference is it goes into one industry's pocket versus what might come out of another industry's pocket due to negative effects. A little bit more abstract is some of these.
Shannon, if you can wrap it up here pretty quickly. We're pushing 9 o'clock, and we need to spin it down here.
Okay, a couple last sentences. We're looking at some of the more abstract valuation of the benefit, ecosystem services benefits that are coming from the reintroduction, including blue carbon or carbon sequestration. And again, we're going to be looking at some of the non-market values due to the existence of the sea otter reintroduction. That's it, Bob.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. There's a bunch of several questions tonight. One from Bob Etter is really, what about the situation on the Washington coast? We weren't able to find anybody in the time frame we wanted for tonight to talk about the Washington experience, but we definitely want to understand that too. So let me just summarize, because it is getting late, and for Tim Tinker, he's well into his birthday day here. This is just the beginning. What we wanted to do is to let you know kind of what's going on behind the scenes with some of the look at the economic effects and the modeling that is going into the feasibility study, the economic impact assessment. Those two documents are going to be released for review and comment for a number of months. We hope by middle of August. We had hoped for early August, but I think we're going to need to bump that a couple of weeks. And at that point, we're going to open it up for all just like your normal public review. And at that point, we're going to want to continue this discussion and even zero in a little bit more where people want to zero in on questions and answers. And then later in the year, after 3 months of this public review, we hope to then produce a final feasibility study document and a final economic impact assessment at the end of the year. So this is, as I responded to one of the comments here from Lori, this is just the beginning of a real dialogue with some facts and some numbers for us to work with. This is all new to me tonight, seeing what has been presented from both Tim and from Shannon and Hans. So, and I appreciate Ginny and Tracy sharing the experiences in the other two states. We'll continue to work on this and fill in information. If there is any burning questions, I guess we can take a moment here, put them down on chat. So, but otherwise, I think that we're going to call this a night. If you have concerns or comments, please get a hold of me. I'm Bob at Elakha Alliance, all one word, .org, and we'll continue this dialogue. In the meantime, Thanks to everybody for participating, all of the participants, the presenters, and especially you out there who took the time to sit in on this and listen and learn. We appreciate it, and we'll keep